What is up, guys, and welcome to another PLO Poker Coaching high stakes hand review. I'm going to jump into a pretty juicy pot here where we end up playing a 3.5k pot. And yeah, I want to see what your guys' thoughts are, whether you would have played it different, what the solver's kind of thinking, and why we potentially played it a little bit different. So let's jump into it. Pretty standard open here, three-handed on the button, especially deep. And when we get three bets, I mean, we're basically calling range. Almost, maybe there's a few percent of hands that we're going to fold, but defending a very high frequency when we're almost 200 bigs deep in position. So we call and we get this 7-7-5 flop, obviously very nice flop for us. And our opponent goes ahead and bets half pot on the flop. And it's an interesting spot because we are a lot deeper here than 100 big blinds, and that is going to impact what his betting frequency should actually look like. So if we do look at the differences in PLO training, we will see that at 200 big blinds, this is actually a very, very high frequency check board, and you can just check range effectively. This is a little bit more connected, but if you look at 775, it's not really that much different. We'll confirm that in a minute in Monka Solver. And this is very, very different to a 776 board at 100 big blinds. So the difference being that we need a lot less equity to stack off. We have, a much more dominating range in terms of overpairs. The button's going to have likely less 7x. Remember, he's opening 50% and calling range in a 200 big blind scenario. And even if we get called, we're going to have to play not fun turns out of position at still a reasonable SPR. So the fact that this is quite connected is always relatively bad for the out of position 3-better. If you look at different boards here, right, like 884, which looks close, but definitely much less connected. We'll see that we actually have a 26% bet frequency, even at 200 big blinds deep here, just because our overpairs are still dominating. And if you look at 100 big blinds, it is going to be betting range on a board like this. So those are kind of things that we do have to factor in when we're thinking about playing our opponents. Are they considering this? Are they even thinking that they're 170 big blinds deep and playing closer to a 200 big blind strategy? So if we look at Monka Solver of this spot, and we look at the solver, we see here that obviously very low bet frequency with the 775, a little bit less connected, so likely why it's slightly higher. So opponent should really be checking full range. So how do we adjust to that if our opponent is going to bet something like 50-60%, which is likely going to be the case against players that are not thinking too deeply about SPRs? We actually probably get to raise a little bit more. They're going to be betting more merge. They're going to have more bluffs. So we can take a little bit more advantage with our in-position raising. Here, as you see with this half pot size bet, we're supposed to raise 23% of the time, which is still relatively high. And if this was a 100 big blind spot, we kind of discussed this the other day in a similar 3-bet pot in position calling, that we don't have too many raising ranges against smaller bets, just because the out position player is playing a much more polarized strategy. However, in this situation at the higher SPR, we do want to protect and push our equity when we are in position. So we do want to build a pot with our very strong hands or with our very best bluffs, so that we can apply pressure on future streets and leverage, our whole stack, on turns and rivers. So if we think about what 7x hands that we do want to raise here from a solver perspective, right? So any hand not bigger than 7-5 and a 7, we'll see that we're raising a good portion of these hands facing the half pot size stab. And then what kind of side cards do we kind of want in order to raise a bit more? Well, obviously an ace is very important because our opponent, although he will still have a lot of ace-ace, will have side cards with that, and if we raise without an ace, you know, we're going to be running into pretty sort of low equity situations. And here also, if we have like a king or a queen, we're kind of going to be just sort of calling a little bit more. So the ace is very important on the flop in order to kind of go for that raise, which I think is relatively obvious for most people. And the other reason to go for a raise here is when we have some sort of like protection against, you know, hands that our position is going to bet with. And so when we have hands like ours, right? So when we look at our hand here and we have 7-9 Jack 4, it is going to actually start getting closer to a type of a hand that we want to raise with. When we add in that 4, we block some of the future runouts of straight draws. So we have some more playability on turns. We are able to raise, and you know, our opponent shouldn't be bet folding a hand like aces, so we can keep these hands in the pot with a raise with future playability. So the 9 less so, but that 4 is pretty important when we have playability against the lower straight draws, but unblock potentially the higher straight draws like overpairs and gut shots. In game, I actually elected to just go for a call here, and my thinking was that obviously we don't have the best 7, but we have pretty good playability on future runouts, and I don't think my opponent, one who's misreading this board in terms of his advantage, is going to bet call as many aces as the solver would. The solver is basically not really bet folding aces, you know, maybe like 10-15% of the time, maybe a little bit higher. So when my opponent is going to fold some of those hands, and I have blockers to his more bluff type hands, like if he has like gut shots here that he's going to lead with that I'm just going to fold out, I actually have a good bluff catcher going forward, and so I elected to just call here and keep our opponent in the pot. So when we have Jack 9 4 7, you'll see here that the solver does want to raise a lot of the time, but the EV difference is actually really small, so it's close between the two actions. So I don't think, you know, once we consider the kind of exploits of our opponent, that you know, it's too bad of a play. Okay, just stop my puppy from eating all of my lines real quick. Okay, so when we jump into the turn, what we want to think about is, you know, how good is this turn for imposition's range and for our position's range. So for our position, this is probably one of the worst turn cards that, you know, he can have, right? So this really damages his overpairs. We pick up equity. He also doesn't have the overpairs and flush draws, which are going to be able to back call. And we obviously have, you know, a lot more boats in this situation. We have a lot more straights. And so this is a card where likely you're going to see sort of checking range. And you can see here, like, this is one of the worst cards, basically checking range. So the good cards are going to be like aces, obviously like an overpair, like kings, queens. Those are going to be decent candidates. A deuce as well in terms of blanks. But this 6 is one of the worst, so we should see a lot of checks from our opponent. And I think, you know, a lot of people in the population are going to find the check on this card, at least at reasonable stakes, even when they do have a stronger hand. So we do get check too, and then we kind of have the decision here of whether we want to bet or check back. And my thinking in game was, it's very likely that he has aces. A lot of people play this way with aces, and if he doesn't have aces, he's very likely to have bluffs, because people are probably going to, you know, see bet on the turn a little bit, at least with boats and straights here. So what I'm thinking with this, especially with a 9 and a 4, is that if I check back, there's not really any bad rivers for me other than an ace. You know, I'm going to block all of the 4 card straights kind of that can come in. And if I am behind right now, I get to save a bet, and I also keep his bluffs in that he might, use on a few rivers like an 8 or something like that when I check back. And if we get a card like a king, queen, jack, like a non-4 card straight river, I might be able to sneak in a value bet, whereas, I think a lot of aces at this point are going to fold on the turn without any backup from the population. So if we look at the solver solution for that, it does kind of agree. So we have any hand kind of weaker than a straight here, and we have a 7. We'll see that we do have like a pretty high check back frequency once we do get checked to, of like almost 70%. And types of hands that are going to be those really good checkbacks, when we have that 4 or we have an 8, those are going to be the good kind of check back candidates. We're blocking a ton of his continuing range. Again, we have a good bluff catcher on a lot of rivers, and so those types of hands make kind of good check back candidates, and not that many people are going to check back 7x here against 3-bet ranges. So you will actually get a lot more value than expected on rivers from either bluffs or light call downs. And obviously overcards as well are okay because we block more of the marginal hands that he could bet on the flop, like kings and queens. That mean that we reduce our check frequency a little bit. So I think we were kind of in line there from a solver perspective of checking this back, even though we have obviously the straight draws for backup. But once we start getting called here or raised, it's a very gross spot. So we do check back, and we get the absolute magical river of the 7, quadding up on the river. And this part obviously isn't really the portion of the educational structure of the video, because obviously our opponent is going to have a good amount of pot size bets here, and the way that he's played this hand, it is just very obvious that he has aces and has the second nuts here. So obviously we jam, and he tank called in game, which I actually really just don't like. And when you get into these spots, and I'm sure you know it, when you have aces and you get the quad run out, the trip run out, and you get raised on the river, there's really no hands here. Like, there's no bluffs that the population is really finding here. Taking a straight and turning it into a bluff, or having, pre-flop blockers around the 7. It's just not really happening. So he does go ahead and call, and shows down the aces, and we scoop a nice 3.5k pot. But yeah, let me know in the comments if you guys would have played this differently. Obviously a nice result, but there are obviously a lot of considerations on the flop and turn where we could have taken a different strategy. Thanks everyone for tuning in, and good luck at the tables out there.